Join us in Mark chapter 14 as we are continuing to finish up Passion Week. Such an exciting chapter, Mark chapter 14. I'm very pumped for this. And we get to see a series of amazing contrasts. We get to see another in-depth look at worship. And I really enjoy getting into kind of just some of the mechanics or the meat and potatoes of worship. What is worship? Something that sometimes becomes the view on it just changes sometimes. So it's nice to be able to come back to a place where you can look at ground truth as an aspect of worship. But my Bible, like a lot of your Bibles, probably has a whole series of these little headings added into them. So in mine, in just the maybe 26 verses that we're going to look at this morning, but it says the plot to kill Jesus and the anointing at Bethany. Judas agrees to betray Jesus. Jesus celebrates Passover with his disciples, and Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper. So we see these neat little headings to kind of break down some of the chapter for us, break it down in these little groupings. But what I like about, especially this section in 14, something I really want to focus on this morning, is that God is in control. And these headings are great, the way they kind of break it down, but I really wish they would all kind of say the same thing. Some of mine have been scratched out in my Bible, and I just wrote in there that God is in control. We're going to see that God is in control of his timeline and things that are happening. God is in control of worship. He's the one that sets the bounds for worship. God is sovereign over men and property. God is sovereign, and God alone is one that institutes the covenants. So that's essentially how I have scratched out my headings, and those are kind of the headings that I've added in there myself. So, chapter 14, verse 1, after 2 days, it was a feast of Passover, or it was Passover and the feast of unleavened bread. So that's kind of where we're coming to right now. In a few days, what Mark is telling us, it's going to be Passover. Passover was a big deal. Passover is one of those feasts that we greatly look forward to. We don't really have one, I don't think, that we could really, living in the West, kind of compare it to. A lot of things were really kind of hung on the concept of Passover, familiar Passover, from the book of Exodus. That's kind of where it came from. It was memorial for their deliverance from Egypt. Eventually, as a body, we're trying to find a teacher, but we're going to find someone to kind of take us through a Seder dinner, to take us through a Passover meal, to show us what each of the elements represent. But we remember at that very specific time, at the last plague, that the angel was going to be sent to Egypt. And they were to take the blood of a lamb, and cover the lintels of their door with the blood of the lamb, and the angel would pass over their house the night of their deliverance. And they were required to come to this meal. Or they're required to have this meal once a year. If you were within 15 miles of Jerusalem, you're required to come to Jerusalem to have that meal. But everybody wanted to go to Jerusalem to have that meal. They estimate upwards of 250 to 260,000 sacrifices would take place for this event. I'm not going to bother doing the math because any of you that know me already know how that's going to work out for you. So you can do the math yourself. So let's just say we're going to round up to 260,000. 260,000 animals being sacrificed. It was one animal roughly to the household, which would be about 10 people. That is a lot of people crammed into Jerusalem. So what does that mean? It's busy. Has anybody been to a bazaar in like Mexico or a different country? Even the bazaar, anybody been to, there's some kind of bazaar of a thing that takes place in Vegas, just outside of Las Vegas, and it's huge. And there's people like clamoring, and they're pushing, and they're shoving. There's normally one division of priests on deck for the sacrifices. When you get closer to the Passover, all the divisions of the priests were on deck. The Romans were on high alert during these feast days, especially for Passover, because everybody had this expectation of the Messiah at Passover. So the Romans always kind of anticipated maybe some riots or some revolts. There's a lot going on. And Passover takes place in a day, So you have the actual Passover, and then you have the 7-day feast, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that would take place after Passover. So it was a huge deal, and we'll continue to kind of break down Passover also as we get into the book of Exodus. As soon as we finish up with Genesis, which is coming soon, we'll take more time to kind of break down all of the aspects of Passover. So at this time, so just interesting that they have the expectation of the Messiah. Every single Passover has expectation of the Messiah. This Passover, the Messiah is there and is going to be eating with his disciples there in Jerusalem. The thing that they've been waiting on since the very beginning. We see the first prophecy dealing with the Messiah as early as Genesis chapter 3. They've been waiting this whole time, and now the Messiah is in their midst. And we have almost everybody surrounding the Messiah responding to him differently. The religious leaders that were supposed to be readying the people for the Messiah, we're going to see here in verse 1 and verse 2, working against the Messiah. We're going to see the disciples, not so much this morning, but next Sunday as we finish up, theoretically, chapter 14. We're going to see them working kind of against the plan just a little bit. We had people with a great deal of profession, as we discussed in the fig tree, at the triumphal entry, and that's going to change as Jesus is being brought into the courts for his trial. So just kind of interesting, and we'll continue to break that one down. And the chief priests and the scribes sought how they might take him by trickery and put him to death. But they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar of the people. What a powerful concept. So we see the priests, instead of being in line with the will of God and the plan of God, they're working very much against it. They have a fear of people. Fear of people is a funny thing, isn't it? It's easy for us to be afraid of people. It really is. Sometimes in a grand sense, sometimes in a small sense. We have those people, those wild cards, we just don't want to set off. Some people have a weird sense of humor. A lot of us like practical jokes. I love practical jokes. That's not an invitation, so don't get all weird, funny ideas. My office locks now. But I have a buddy that we learned really quick that it's not a good idea for us to do practical jokes on each other because we don't really have boundaries. You need boundaries. So I don't mess with my buddy so much anymore now that we're kind of distanced, but we learned real quick that's not the one you want to mess with. But when you become afraid of people and you become afraid of the masses of people, it changes things. It forces you into a place of compromise to avoid conflict, to avoid confrontation, or to avoid essentially kind of being on the out. They are not worried at all about their sin, that they're going to take him by trickery, put him to death. Even Pilate knew that the reason that the religious leaders were working against Christ was out of jealousy. They're not worried about their sin. They're not worried about the trickery. They're not worried about God's plan. Just interesting. We have that contrast already. What is their plan? Well, we don't want to take him during the feast day because even though the masses didn't truly see Christ as Messiah, they did see him as a prophet. So they did not want to take him during the feast day. They did not want to have an uproar. It's funny, is what they wanted, they still didn't get it. Because it is God's plan for Jesus to be taken during the feast day. So they're not worried about their sin. They're not worried about trespassing against the plan of God. They're not worrying that they are in that place of trying to stop God's plan, but they're afraid of people. So verse 3, and being in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at the table, a woman came having an alabaster flask of very costly oil of spikenard. Then she broke the flask and poured it on his head. And we see this also in John chapter 12 and 13. So we see this woman being identified in the Gospel of John as Mary. She comes in with this alabaster flask filled with spikenard oil, and it kind of tells us just how expensive it is. It's not the vase that was so expensive, and we'll talk about that too, but it was the oil. Most commentators believe that this oil, especially at that point in time, something had to be imported, which generally came from India. So we already see how much imported some of that expensive stuff is already, but it's a big deal. And it would come in a small jar, and that jar was sealed up. And often they would use it as, something of a leverage. Well, if I need to make extra money, or I need something to be as, not a dowry, but I need you to kind of hang on to this for a little bit. I'm having a loss for words this morning. Hang on to this for a little bit until I can get the money, and then, I'll get it back. It's very expensive. And once you open it, that's it. They didn't have the fancy screw caps that we do on our Old Spice bottles or on our perfume bottles. It wasn't something that was reusable. Once you broke it, so you had this kind of a small bowl with a skinny neck that was sealed off. So in order to open it up, you had to break it. So they would broke it, and she is pouring it out on his head. And in the kind of the original language, it wasn't just one drop. It was the whole bottle of this very costly oil. And what we see from Mary is this is her form here of worship. Now we get to really kind of dig into the concept of worship. But there were some who were indignant among themselves and said, "Why was this fragrant oil wasted? For it might have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor." And they criticized her sharply. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a good work for me." One of my favorite things to talk about is worship. What is worship? Have you ever really thought about that? So we say, we're going to have Sunday morning worship. What's the first thing that goes through your mind? Probably the first thing that went through my mind 15, 20 years ago. I don't want to go to church and sing for an hour and a half. That doesn't sound like fun. Some of you have had the very grand misfortune of hearing me sing without people surrounding me. It's not fun for me. I'm not a singer. I just don't have it. I don't have tune. I don't have anything. And I forgot the lyrics to my own song. For those of you that also joined us that evening. What is worship? At the very root, what worship is to ascribe worth to something. So now that kind of changes things. We also really have this idea of, what is worship? Well, we're going to gather to church, and for 30, 40 minutes, Cassie's going to come up, or any other worship leaders they're going to come up, and they're going to guide us through songs for the next 20, 30, 40 minutes. That's worship. That certainly is a factor of worship, but we're missing kind of the grand scheme of worship. Often we don't see worship as a work, as something that we do. We don't see worship as a sacrifice, potentially something that we leave, something that we put at the feet of Jesus. Those of you who've been joining us on Friday nights, you remember Genesis chapter 22. Very powerful chapter of Abraham and his son Isaac. And he was called to offer his son Isaac to the Lord. So he grabs his son, grabs the wood, grabs the fire, grabs a couple of servants and his son, and they start making their way to Mount Moriah. And he tells the servants to stay behind. You remember this passage? What does he tell the servants? You stay here while the lad and I go up and worship. That the sacrifice was a form of worship. Such a powerful thing. So we see Mary ascribing quite the worth in this aspect of worship. 300 denarii. That's a lot. 1 denarii is about a day's wage. 300 denarii was about a year's wage. So about a year's wage. How much do some of us make in a year? I mean, can you imagine? As your form of worship, whatever it is in your year's wage, that thing has been laid at the feet or poured over the head of your Lord. That's a powerful aspect to worship. We forget that worship should be costly. Coming in and us singing together as a fellowship and praising God, that is amazing. But it's really not that costly. How do you know when you're doing worship right? How do you know when you're giving right? Not just of your stuff or your finances or whatever it is, but of your time, of yourselves. Does it sting? It reminds me with David trying to buy the field that he's going to build the temple on. So he goes to the owner of the field and he asks him, he's like, hey, how much? The guy finds out what it's for. Oh, you're going to build the temple of the Lord on land that I own. How amazing. You can have it for free. That's a good deal. We love good deals, and land ain't cheap. And on top of that, not only can you have the land for free, but any of the animals that you need for the sacrifice, you can have those for free too. Free land to build a great big purity building on and a barbecue. That's great. Great deal. Best deal ever. What does David say? Absolutely not. I will not give to the Lord something that costs me nothing. Such a powerful concept. So we see that it is costly. We see that it is often criticized. We'll come back to that portion of criticized. We see that worship really should require sacrifice, and we see worship being something simple. Simple worship is just the best. Not all the entanglements, not all the nonsense, not all the tech, not all the weird stuff. We see something just perfectly simple. And she's pouring this out over Jesus. They say that it is wasted. And we're going to see this isn't wasted, but we see that worship is always beneficial. Especially when there is a sting in it. Because it means that you're putting less focus into yourself and more focus into the Lord. So it says in verse 4 that there were some who were indignant. I love how Mark and Matthew and Luke, they leave it that vague. There were some that have it indignant. That makes sense to me, especially in Mark. We'll try and keep it in context a little bit. Why is Mark not going to really name names of who was indignant? Mark probably developed a lot of his context for writing his gospel from Peter. Peter's probably one of those that was indignant. But who started it? John doesn't hold back. John says it was Judas. Why are you wasting something worth 300 denarii? Why are you wasting it instead of selling it? You could sell it for 300 denarii. In my mind, this is not in text, this is just my opinion. It was probably worth more than that. Why is that? We don't really try and sell any, some of us might, but we're trying to sell a blanket, or we're having a yard sale. A lot of us have done a yard sale. You've got a pair of worn shoes. Let's say those shoes are, I don't know, Vans. Vans go anywhere from $70 to $130. Expensive footwear. If you're having a yard sale, you're going to sell those Vans for $130. Diesel owners always crack me up. I used to be a diesel owner. Cummins guys are the worst. How much is that Cummins worth? Doesn't matter what year, it's worth 50 grand. It's a Cummins. You're not going to sell it for that. So when they're saying, well, it's worth at least 300 denarii, I'm thinking, well, that thing's probably got a little more onto it. And they criticized her sharply. And they say that it was wasted. In John chapter 12 and John chapter 13, not only do they identify who at least started it, other people did kind of become indignant as well, which we'll get into, but Judas started it. His heart wasn't for the poor. What does it tell us in the Gospel of John? He was stealing from the money box. So 300 denarii for the poor is probably something closer to 150 for the poor, 150 for the pocket of Judas. So he's not actually concerned with the concept of benevolence, but rather what it is that he's going to stick in his pockets, as he is the one in charge of the money box. So we see why he initializes the criticizing, but why did everybody else join in? Why did everybody else criticize her sharply? When we see someone doing something better than we do it, or when we see someone doing something that we know we should be doing, what do? We criticize. We get bitter. It's like looking into a mirror. The people that we judge someone for in their sins, one of the reasons Jesus tells us in his discourse, judge not lest ye be judged, for the measure in which you judge another shall be measured to you. Why do you judge someone about the stick in their eye when you have a plank in yours? when I see a sin in my life, instead of dealing with it, it's easier to find somebody else that clearly has that same sin than just badger them for it. They are seeing someone love more. They are seeing someone do more. And it bothers them. What's interesting is this criticizing is coming from, for lack of better words, and they are not probably calling themselves that, but from the more elite group. These disciples are the ones that have been with Jesus. Some of them only a year, some of them a little over 2 years. They should know. Some of his believers that have been in a walk with Christ for some time, that we know that there's certain things that we should do. We see somebody else doing it, what a waste of time. Oh, that person's got a holier than thou attitude. And we'll see them criticize, especially when worship doesn't make sense. We've had that problem. Sometimes worship, the way we worship God, it doesn't make sense. How do we worship? The way we worship, just in the simplest form, in our singing as a body, that doesn't make sense to some people. Different backgrounds, different worship experiences kind of leads one thing to another. I've been asked twice if we were that group that dances around on stage with snakes. I've been asked if this is that group where people kind of come up and they do cartwheels and backflips on stage. Not this guy. I'd like to think that the only reason I don't do backflips up here is because I don't believe in that kind of showmanship, especially in the church. But as big a fan of taco trucks as I am, it's just sadly not the only reason. We'll kind of come back to the rest of those. So they're criticizing her, someone that is loving more or doing more. And we're going to see another aspect to it. It says that she has done a good work for me. It's just kind of interesting that worship, we only see it as singing, when really how we worship the Lord is also in what we are doing, how we are living, what we are doing in our walk with Christ. For you have the poor with you always, and whenever you wish, you may do them good. But me, you do not always have. So Jesus, in effect, is telling them first, it's not a waste of time. It's not a waste of assets to worship. And it is a good work. We'll continue on the concept of the intelligent worship, but on the simplicity of the concept of a good work. We like to think that it's going to be a waste of time or a waste of assets. Why? Because that's what we're used to. How many of us pay our taxes? Theoretically, it's all of us. You don't pay your taxes. My daughter's sitting up front. I pay taxes. So when we're paying our taxes, how often, realistically, and I'm not really saying this to point fingers or to badger or bully the government or any aspect of it, but how many of us feel that our taxes are being wasted? Part of taxes goes to fix roads. Some of the roads are pretty rough. Some of our taxes go to manage wildlife or areas that they are in. I believe in those things. My taxes really should go pay for that. We know that our taxes go to pay for things that we don't want them to pay for. Granted, that is on the government. But there's a lot of things that we believers don't think that our tax money should be going to. So we see it as kind of a waste. You are free to ask, FYI, but do you know where the tithe money goes that you give to the church? You are free to ask. And it's an amazing thing when we get to sit down and discuss where the tithe money goes. It's one of those things I actually get very excited about. We do support our local ministries, like the Rachel Pregnancy Center. We have sent actually several groups, of those of you who don't know, but we kind of tie into the Jesus Film Ministry, which is a fantastic little ministry, and it's a lot of fun. But we have sent missionaries into Africa, and they're getting ready to go into the Philippines. We are a part of that ministry. We have local families that we take care of throughout the year. in practical ways and sometimes in bigger ways. So you're absolutely free to ask where the money is going, but oftentimes, like, well, it's just kind of a waste. Because we get stuck listening to the same guy every single Sunday. Even though I pay my tithes, I should swap it out with somebody else with a little more, I don't know, charisma or something. You remember when Jesus, the second time, he was breaking the loaves and the fish. We remember that. We went through it in the Gospel of Mark. They gave the loaves. But it would seem in the text the disciples did not want to give the fish until they were sure that the few things that they had were safe passing through the hands of Jesus. And we see it as a waste. And we let the world tell us that it's a waste. For me, in my early years when I was a believer, to me it was a waste to come in here and to sing. Huge waste. It was very wasteful for me. I'm a very kind of a critically thinking kind of individual. I like to study, devote my time to study, devote my time to teaching, devote my time to sharing the gospel, teaching the word, raising up believers, singing. What does it accomplish? Nothing. It's a waste of air. That's how I felt. And it stunted my growth because it was a wrong aspect. And we will let people know, like, what you're doing for worship is ridiculous. Maybe not what you're singing, but also what you're doing, what you're devoting, what you're giving to God out of your time, or out of your assets, or out of yourself. And that message is also for us. Don't trouble her. She has done a good work. You have done a good work. Man, how powerful is it just to sing, just to come together as a body to lift our voices to the Lord. The word clearly calls that one a sweet-smelling aroma. That should be very powerful for us and very encouraging. Jesus tells them, you'll always have the poor with you. A lot of people take this verse out of context. What does this passage mean? Very literally, Jesus, on this night, after he's done with the dinner, after he's done with the upper room discourse, which is not covered in Mark, but it is in John, he will go back to the Garden of Prayer and he will be arrested. The disciples will no longer have that direct that access to Jesus. Jesus is saying, and we'll continue with the aspect of intelligent worship, but I am going to be gone. I'm not going to be here any longer. You have time with the poor. She is doing something amazing for me right now. In verse 8, she has done what she could. That's encouraging. She has done what she could. Which to us really wouldn't seem like very much. I looked at buying, because I'm just curious on what it smells like. I've bought frankincense. I buy myrrh. I buy all these things in the Bible that you can actually get your hands on. I'm curious what they smell like, or at least a close idea of what they are. And frankincense smells amazing. Great anointing oil. All pastors should have it. The oil that I was blessed with, it was cooking oil. I didn't know that. So when I anointed people, I was like, man, I'm in the best church. It was before I came here. I was like, oh, I'm one of the best fellowships everywhere. Everybody eats tacos. Everybody smelled like tacos because I was pouring like cooking oil on everybody's head. It's not the same as frankincense. Frankincense smells amazing. I looked at buying a bottle of spikenard. You can pay it for $15 on Amazon. And I don't know that it smells like the stuff that came from India 2,000 years ago, but I imagine it smells amazing. Some of us, me not so much. I just smell the way that I do. Take it as you will. But some of us have, body sprays. I imagine all of us have deodorant. But some of us have perfumes or colognes. Does it really sound like very much to pour that out on the feet of Jesus as, as your form of worship? What does that sound like to you? That accomplishes nothing. That's a waste. We do that in our lives. I don't have anything to offer Jesus, so I'm just not going to. And it stops us in our tracks from serving. It stops us in our tracks from offering, and it really stunts our growth because we don't fully get to learn kind of that aspect of Christ and his heart to us. She has done what she could. That is what he's desiring of you, to do what you can. She has come beforehand to anoint my body for burial. An important aspect to worship. As a Calvary Chapel distinctive, we believe in intelligent worship. What does that mean? whatever it is that we are doing for worship, it is Bible-based. Well, how come you guys don't dance around with snakes? That has been asked. And it was just a funny conversation every single time. Because it's not in the Bible. That is not biblical. How come you don't praise, sing, teach, or speak in tongues during the body of the congregation? Because that is unbiblical. Does the body possess gifts of speaking in tongues? Yes. The gift of prophecy? Yes. I believe that the gifts are still in full effect today. But as we'll see, once we finish up in the Gospel of Mark, in Paul's letter to the church in Corinth, the first epistle, the letter to 1 Corinthians, letter of 1 Corinthians to Corinth, everybody was trying to do these things all at once. And it was wicked chaotic. We worship a God of order. That's why we do not do it. Who in this body right now has the gift of interpretation? So if I were to start speaking in tongues right now and nobody could interpret it, I look like a crazy person, especially to a new believer. Nobody's going to be able to understand what I'm saying because there is no process of interpretation, and that would be unbiblical. We believe in intelligent worship. What they are criticizing of Mary, what we would probably criticize of Mary, would you just dumped out $300 on Jesus' head? Now let's say somebody else did see it coming. This is a very cynical way to look at it. Why would she do that? He's going to be dead in 15 hours. Very cynical way to look at it, but we do that. We see that as something of a waste. We try and teach kids to be responsible with their money, which some of us try very hard. If you can remember back to your youth, how much money did you spend on candy? What was the greatest thing you could buy? Man, if I save up my money, my night was Pringles and Mountain Dew. I wasted so much money on Pringles and Mountain Dew. How many of us had hobbies as kids that you don't have now? The amount of money I put in comic books, baseball cards, all that stuff is all my cards are packed away in the box, and my kids have recently discovered my comic books. So most of them aren't even in one section anymore. 50 copies turned into 200 copies of To Be Continueds. That's a waste. We try and teach that to our kids. You don't waste your money on that one. If you save up for the next 60 years, you can buy a boat. We try and teach them to look ahead. It looks wasteful. But what they didn't know was that for Mary, that was a very, very amazing but an intelligent worship. She understood. She has done what she could. She has come beforehand. It was premeditated to anoint my body for burial. She was the only one, and she was not in that inner core. She certainly was a disciple. I believe that. But she wasn't in the inner core of the disciples, the 12. They didn't get it. Nobody else from verse 1, everybody expecting the Messiah, they didn't get it. She got it. Jesus is dying, and she's giving, essentially, if you were, she's giving Jesus flowers before the funeral. How many of us have had a friend or a family, and I don't say this to break your heart or melt your whatever, or give you a bad day, but how many of us have taken flowers to a funeral for someone that you have never given flowers to? This is cynical. They're not going to enjoy them now. They're dead. This oil is a part of that anointing process for burial after they've died. We see this form of worship in essentially one other place. Where is that? With the 3 wise men. And they show up with the gold, the gift for the king, frankincense, the gift for the priest, and the myrrh, the gift for the sacrifice. They were able to see it too. Neither of these groups inside the inner circle. Assuredly, I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be told as a memorial to her. 2 amazing concepts to that one. This simple form of worship from Mary, our simple form of worship, hers, that nobody else understood, it is going to be remembered everywhere that the gospel is preached. That should show you how important, no matter how small, how important your worship is to God. And another amazing aspect of it is the memorial that she gains because of it. She was not planning on that. If I dump this oil out on Jesus' head, everybody's going to know my name forever. Joke's on you, Peter. That's not what she was doing. The disciples, in collecting this up, in writing the letters, and disseminating these things, I don't believe the disciples knew they were going to be written for us and maintained 2,000 years later. This act of worship being recorded, this is kind of her memorial, and she gains it by loving Jesus, not by fighting and jockeying. We remember on several occasions the disciples fighting over who was going to have a higher level of authority. And we see Jesus rebuking them a number of times for it. Her and her act of worship, her and her loving Jesus. It's kind of important. It's your relationship with Christ. It's your loving Jesus. That's what makes it lasting, not simply the works. So then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray him to them. And we'll see later in the text how much he betrays them for. We already kind of know that one, right? 30 pieces. 30 pieces of silver, 300 denarii. This kind of gives us our next contrast. She valued Christ very highly. Judas very lightly. Man, such an amazing, just a concept. So we see Judas deciding, so he leaves, he breaks away, he decides that he is going to betray Christ. I believe that this verse kind of follows closely for a reason. We have these grand ideas, not us, but just in general, of why Judas betrays Jesus. And the more popular one, especially that's gaining steam right now, is Judas really wasn't the bad guy. All Judas was doing was trying to find a way to get Jesus to fully step into his role as Messiah. That Judas was really trying to help Jesus. The word makes it very clear that it's greed. Here he moves, I believe, in direct response to himself being rebuked for criticizing Mary for pouring out the 300 denarii bottle of spikenard. So he goes to the chief priests to betray him to them. I really love these kind of passages. We love good guys in a story. We have bad guys in a story. We have plot. Some of us, like myself, I don't like suspense. I like very straightforward movies. No plot sounds great. One of my favorites, and it's probably the greatest movie in all of cinema history, Princess Bride. That's right. That's right. Almost no plot. The whole plot of the movie is given in like the first 5 minutes. We're going to kill the princess so we can go to war with this nation. Okay. Oh, and there's a dude in a mask that's going to go for whatever. He's chasing the other guys. Okay. We like to pretend that the mask changes a bunch of things, but it doesn't. We know exactly who that is. Okay. See? It's the kind of education we have in my home. She knows exactly who it is. We see this scene. We see this shift. Jesus is going to do something. Now, the disciples didn't know, as we'll see, what's going on. They didn't know that Judas was sneaking away to betray Jesus. But let me ask you something, because I love what ifs. What if they did? Hey, where's Judas? Oh, you're not going to believe what that dirtbag's up to. He's going down chief priest right now to find a way to turn Jesus over to him. What do you think the disciples would have done? I can't speak for all of them, but I can speak for Peter. Because we see Peter in the Garden of Gethsemane swinging the sword. Again, that's not going to be mentioned in Mark. Big surprise. Shouldn't also be a surprise where it is mentioned. But Peter's taking that sword, and he's going to lop off the ear of Malchus, one of the guards. Peter's just a bad shot. Nobody aims for an ear. Everybody aims for the face. So I can pretty well guess what Peter would have done. Oh, Lord, what are you going to do? We see this little weird plot, and all of a sudden, God is just not in control anymore. When we see in Zechariah chapter 11, verses 12 and 13, I would encourage you to go through that section. We see that God knew the whole time. Zechariah being written several hundred years before Christ was even born. We cannot forget that God is in control. We cannot forget that God, the reins never leave his hand. One of my favorite sections, one of them, out of all of the book of Revelation, is chapter 4. Chapter 4 is one of the shortest chapters in all of the book of Revelation. And the word that is mentioned, the thing that is mentioned the most in Revelation chapter 4, do you remember what it is? It's the throne. The throne of God, and all of the emblems and all of the symbolism that is packed into describing the throne of God shows that it's not going anywhere ever. It shows its permanence, thus shows God's permanence. He is in control. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. So he sought how he might conveniently betray him. When they had opportunity, when they heard they have opportunity to seize Christ, they were very glad about it. Such a painful verse. So he sought how he might conveniently betray him. That's an interesting word. It's not the same kind of convenient as we would think about it. It's like, oh, my 3:30 massage got canceled. We can stick the betray Jesus thing right there in that time slot and everything's going to be fine. Not that kind of convenient, but an opportune time. We see that concept out where else? Matthew chapter 4. The temptation of Christ. And it says that the devil departed him for what? A more opportune time. I really like that contrast. Don't you? We do understand that the enemy, or bad guys, especially as we go through Psalms and Proverbs, bad guys are always looking for an opportune time to do something bad. I really like how they're taking this opportune time to try and get one over on Jesus. Things like that make us nervous. There's somebody out to get me. And then the whole wheels start kind of going through our head. But we kind of completely forget that nothing escapes the eyes of God. The whole time they're thinking they're acting outside of God's will, they don't even know that they're fulfilling his will. Now, on the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover lamb, his disciples said to him, "Where do you want us to go and prepare that you may eat the Passover?" That's a legitimate question. That's a great question. That's a very tactically sound question from the disciples to Jesus. Why? They are within 15 miles of Jerusalem. They're staying at Bethany, just on the other side of the Mount of Olives. Well, Lord, we're within 15 miles. We're supposed to eat in Jerusalem. Jerusalem's bigger than Bethany. Where are we going to eat? What's the other aspect to that question? Lord, there's a whole bunch of people over there that don't like you. Where do you want to eat so that they can't do anything? So that they can't harm you or, us? Where are we going to go? And he sent out 2 of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the city, and a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him. Wherever he goes in, say to the master of the house, the teacher says, 'Where is the guest room in which I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' Then he will show you a large upper room, finished and prepared. There make ready for us." So his disciples went out and came into the city and found it just as he had said to them. And they prepared the Passover meal. Part of our worship, we really don't think about it so much, is obedience. These disciples, granted we've seen it elsewhere in the Word, the disciples were asked to go into Jerusalem and look for a guy carrying a water bottle. You don't really get any more vague than that. Or do you? You have to remember that the carrying of the water pitcher was not the man's job typically. If you saw a man carrying a water pitcher, it was kind of like the lowest thing for the household slave. It was typically the women, as we've also seen throughout the Word, but culturally it was typically the women that would go and get the water. So you're going to go into the city, you're going to find a dude carrying a water pitcher. Once you find that guy, follow him. So that looks weird already. You're going to follow this guy to his house, go into his house, say to the master of the house, "Where is the room?" for me and my disciples to eat Passover. Sometimes God asks weird stuff. And we see them going forward, not even them asking questions. All right, let's go. We're going to go find a guy with a water pitcher. They leave Bethany, go into Jerusalem. They find the guy with the water pitcher. And they move forward in full obedience of these things. And they go forward. So we get to see that God is sovereign ruler over men. We get that, don't we? As believers, we accept that God is sovereign over our lives. Lord, we call you Lord, which means whatever you want me to do, I'm going to do it. We as believers should give God our lives. Like, you are Lord, I am servant. What you want me to do, I'm going to go do it. This is kind of like the driving force of our life. Especially for a life that's pursuing to the way of the cross, pursuing to Jesus. Lord, you tell me to do something, I'm going to go and do it. We get that. We accept that he's sovereign ruler over our lives, but do we accept that God is sovereign ruler over our property? I think it's harder, doesn't it? But Lord, that's my boat. That's my spare bedroom. Those are my funds. Or this is my time. I worship with you an hour on Sunday. But Lord, after that, I got bills, I got work, I've got this, and if I don't get out and pursue my hobbies, my head's going to explode. I think it was William MacDonald that asked the question, do we give God ready access to everything in our lives? What's interesting, too, is what's missing from the text. The owner of the house and the owner of the room. Something that was already kind of preordained. We see that servant and that master of the house and the disciples that went to go and to look, they had responsive hearts that they put themselves and their stuff at God's disposal. So in the evening, he came with the 12. Why all the secrecy? Jesus has more things for his disciples, and as we discussed, there's a lot of people in Jerusalem that don't want Jesus in Jerusalem. So something of a security measure. So in the evening, he came with the 12. Now as they sat and ate, Jesus said, assuredly, I say to you, one of you who eats with me will betray me. And they began to be sorrowful and to say to him one by one, is it I? And another said, is it I? He answers and said to them, it is the one of the 12 who dips with me in the dish. I've always kind of marveled over that passage. Us in hindsight, or that have read our Bibles, it's kind of easy-ish to figure out who it is. It's easy to kind of put the finger on Judas. We call him Judas Iscariot. You have to remember that Iscariot is not his last name. If he did have a last name, it would be Judas Bar Simon. I think it was Simon. Judas, son of Simon, is what bar means, son of. Iscariot likely points out that he is from Kerioth. Kerioth being south of Jerusalem. Judas is the only one that was not from the Galilean region. So it's easy for us, like, oh, it's Judas. He is obviously the bad guy. We've seen the famous painting of the Last Supper, completely inaccurate, but a pretty picture nonetheless. Which one's Judas? Have you really thought about that one? I'm going to look at the painting, and I'm going to try and figure out which one's Judas without trying to pay attention to the seating charts whatsoever. It's like, oh, he's always the one with his back turned to Jesus. He's also like always the one with the darkest hair. I don't know what it is, but like bad guys, but they have like the darker hair. They are so distracted over themselves that they don't even realize that it's Judas. Have you ever kind of picked up on that one? Judas disappears from the supper, and it was like, oh, well, he has the money box. He's probably just going to go buy something. Like, they completely don't even get it. And they're so distracted that he's been pilfering from the money box the whole time. They never noticed. And here at the Last Supper, and this is what really makes me kind of chuckle. It's like, oh, Lord, is it Peter? Is it Andrew? We don't hear anything out of Andrew. Is it the zealot? He's already used to turning. He's used to stabbing a whole bunch of people. Maybe it's the zealot. Is it John, the beloved disciple? Oh, plot twist. M. Night Shyamalan couldn't have written it any better if it was John, the beloved disciple. They're not even pointing the fingers at each other. They are so distracted, one, to either lose their position within the circle, which we have seen in previous texts, or it's our own guilt, our own sin, the own concept of, I really don't know how dark my heart is. What is it that I'm really capable of? So they're so distracted by their own sin, by their own guilt, by their own desires, that they're not even really getting a full handle on what's going on in the situation. But he reminds them, the Son of Man indeed goes just as it is written, fulfillment of prophecy. But woe to the man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had never been born. That is heavy. The same text could certainly be applied to anybody working against Christ. But we see a very powerful contrast. But not only the concept of fulfillment of prophecy, but also how concerned with God's will Jesus is, to the point of obedience and submission of going to the cross. It's a very powerful section for us, even in just 21 verses. With everything going on all around us, it really is easy to assume that God just doesn't really have a handle on it, that things are out of hand. We also have a great deal of churches with a very fatalistic type of mentality. And a lot of churches certainly do adopt it. And a part of fatalism is that God created everything, and then he basically just turned on the switch, and it all just kind of runs and operates on its own. God doesn't have any involvement until the very end. But the last two chapters, well, now since chapter 37 of Genesis, the very heavy theme through the rest of that book is the providence of God, God's wise and benevolent superintendence over all of his creation. Disciples don't know what's going on. Mary knows what's about to happen. Judas is working on trying to make a quick buck, and the priests are trying to silence Jesus. Every single bit all falls within the design of God, all bit of it. We see riddled through the prophets, written upwards of 850 years before the time of Christ, like in the book of Isaiah. This is a fantastic time to worship and lay all things at the feet of Jesus, and be strengthened and comforted in the concept, knowing that he is in charge. God is taking care of it. Let's pray together. Lord, thank you so much for the morning. We're very thankful, Lord, that as a body we can pursue and that we are hungry for your word. We're hungry to grow closer to you and closer to one another. And I pray, Lord, that we would be brought to a place not only of growth, but encouragement of the things, Lord, that we have found in your text. That as men have their plans and they're trying to sneak around, we see, God, that none of it has escaped you. And what's even more impressive than that, Lord, is all the things that we have tried to sneak around with, all the things that we have tried to hide. None of it escapes you. And you've chosen us anyways. Lord, we are so thankful for your heart towards us. And we love you.